Yesterday, I found an old man and his daughter, as tall as he, had lived in the opposite room as spy, which my enemy used to express what they mean on my law using their spies performance. That my real father is not Gong Hao, who was president of the Fuzhou Intermediate Court in 1985. It's my mother's ex-husband, who is short man, and I had never seen him. If my real father is my mother's ex-husband, why did they ban me to marry? And why have they persecuted me for so long? They murdered my mother, then said casually, "Someone is my real father." My mother said he had not had sex with her ex-husband, so my real father can only be Gong Hao. Sometime around 2005, before my mother was murdered, he had told me for several times on the phone that my life is full of energy, which suggested that if he died right away, he would be murdered. On 20th May 2005, before I arrived, my mother had been murdered by the daughters, who carried out the command of the leaders. They could accurately calculate the time because my mother's husband's niece, who is a daughter of another hospital, kept calling me to confirm where I was while I was on the journey from Beijing to Fuzhou, except for the time I was on the plane. After my describing that I might have been poisoned many times, my mother also thought that in her 30s he had been poisoned many times by her husband, who is a spy of Gong Hao's wife, because in my mother's 30s he was dying in the middle of the night several times. Then the daughter continued to say that my mother had heart disease, high blood pressure, coronary heart disease, diabetes. My mother was in good health in her old age because the enemy forced my mother to invest in orange orchard through my mother's husband's forced brother, and then through my mother's husband, so the enemy stopped poisoning my mother in order to force my mother to labor. So my mother believed he had no any disease. One day in 1996, my mother came back from the outside and told me that he had been examined somewhere, and the conclusion was that he had no illness at all. So, about 2005, my mother always suspected that her husband was poisoning her. And my mother said when he couldn't get off the ground, her husband moved up and ignored her. What they didn't think of was that my mother was able to get on and go after he painted 云南白药 Very nature. I sent back from Beijing. Then my mother said that her husband moved back to live with her and tried to poison her again. So my mother couldn't get into the hospital without my mother's husband poisoning my mother more. On instructions from his superiors, when they were going to send my mother to the West. You should understand that Communist Party officials do not understand Chinese, but maybe they understand when written in English.